Nobody tells you that the moment your entire career turns around is going to happen because a woman in a wheelchair couldn't reach the elevator button. There's no chapter in any leadership book about that. No performance review category for it. Nobody sits you down at orientation and says, by the way, the next 10 years of your professional life might hinge on whether you pay attention in a hotel lobby on a Tuesday afternoon in November. But here I am, and that is exactly how it happened. My name is Ted Calloway. I'm 57 years old. I live in Oakville, Ontario with my wife Sandra and our youngest, who is 15, and has very strong opinions about everything including, apparently, my taste in podcasts. I worked for 22 years at Meridian Logistics Group, a mid-sized freight and supply chain company headquartered in Mississauga. For the first 12 of those years, I was one of the best regional operations coordinators they had. I knew it. My numbers showed it. My clients knew it. The only person in the building who seemed genuinely unaware of it was my direct manager, a man named Curtis Webb. I'll get to Curtis. But first I want to tell you what I was carrying that Tuesday, because the story doesn't make sense unless you understand what 12 years of being quietly passed over does to a person. It doesn't make you angry, not exactly. Not the loud kind, anyway. It makes you careful. You stop expecting things. You do excellent work because that's who you are, not because you believe it will be recognized. You eat your lunch at your desk. You stop updating your resume, not because you've given up, but because somewhere underneath the professionalism and the mortgage and the kids' hockey registration fees, you've started to believe that maybe this is just what work is supposed to feel like. That's where I was when I walked into the lobby of the Pinnacle Conference Center on November 14th. I need to tell you about Curtis before I tell you anything else. Curtis Webb, 54, had been my direct supervisor for the last 8 years. He was the kind of manager who made you feel, very specifically and very consistently, like you were doing him a personal favor by doing your job. He was tall, kept his hair too short on the sides, wore a Tag Heuer watch he'd mention at least once per meeting, and had a particular talent for arriving at meetings you had prepared, and speaking as though the insights had occurred to him spontaneously on the drive over. The first time I caught it clearly, I'd spent 3 weeks restructuring our cold chain vendor contracts for the Atlantic provinces. Cut, carrying costs by 11%. Put together a 12-page summary, charts included. Presented it to the regional VP, a quiet man named Alan Forsyth, who nodded, asked 2 good questions, and said he'd follow up. 2 weeks later, Curtis presented the same restructuring model at the National Operations Review. Different slides, same numbers, his name in the footer. I didn't say anything. I was 42. I had a daughter in braces, and Sandra had just gone back to school part-time. The timing was wrong for a confrontation. That was the logic I used every time. The timing was wrong. The timing was always wrong. I had the promotion conversation with Curtis in February. I'd planned it carefully, even had Sandra quiz me on it the weekend before while she was folding laundry. What are you going to say if he deflects? If he gets defensive? If he tells you to be patient? She'd looked at me at one point, mid-fold, and said, Ted, you've been patient for 8 years. If patient were going to work, it would have worked by now. She wasn't wrong. She's rarely wrong. It's occasionally inconvenient. So I sat down with Curtis on a Wednesday morning in February, the kind of cold gray February morning that Southern Ontario does so well, the kind that doesn't commit to snow but also refuses to stop being unpleasant, and I laid it out. 12 years of strong reviews. The Atlantic restructuring. 3 consecutive years running the Ontario East Division under budget. The Edmonton Complex transition I'd managed essentially alone while Curtis was at a leadership retreat in Banff that appeared, from all available evidence, to have been mostly skiing. Curtis listened. He had a very practiced way of listening, nodding slowly with his fingertips together, like he was measuring what you were saying against something important. It always made me feel like I was being evaluated, rather than heard. When I finished, he said, Ted, you're a reliable guy. You know that. I appreciate that. But reliable isn't the same as leadership material. We've talked about this. We've talked about me not being promoted, I said carefully. We haven't talked about specific criteria. I'd like to know what the criteria actually are. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I have thought about almost every day since. Look, Ted, with respect, there are people who drive this company forward, and there are people who keep the engine running. Both matter. But you need to understand which one you are. You're the engine, buddy. Not everyone can be the driver, and that's not a criticism. The engine is essential. He said it kindly. That was the worst part. He said it with genuine warmth, like he was doing me a favor by clarifying my place in the machinery. The engine, buddy. I drove home that night and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. Sandra asked how it went. I told her. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did he just call you a car part?" Essentially. She picked up her mug. "Okay. All right. That's fine. We'll see about that." I didn't say anything, but I didn't argue either. The thing about the Pinnacle Conference Center is that it's the kind of place that holds regional industry events, quarterly association breakfasts, that sort of thing. The Canadian Freight and Logistics Association was hosting its annual November roundtable, and I was there because Meridian had sent me for the third year in a row as our regional representative. Not Curtis, who I suspect found these events less useful than he found his golf game. Me, I arrived on the Tuesday afternoon, checked in and went to drop my things in the room before the 4:30 reception. The lobby of that hotel is large and a bit impersonal in the way of conference hotels that have been renovated twice without anyone agreeing on a direction. Marble floors, brass fixtures that are slightly too yellow, a row of elevators at the far end. I was heading toward those elevators when I noticed her. She was in a manual wheelchair, positioned just to the right of the elevator bank. She was in her late 70s, I'd guess, with white hair cut practically short, reading glasses on a chain, and the particular self-contained stillness of someone who has navigated the world for a long time and learned when to wait and when to ask. She was waiting. She had been waiting, I think, for longer than she should have had to. Because the elevator call button was recessed into the marble wall, at a height that required a reach she couldn't quite make from where she was positioned. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't flagging anyone down. She'd positioned her chair, stretched once toward the button, found she couldn't quite get there, and settled back to wait for someone to come by who might notice. 3 people had gone past by the time I came through the main doors. I watched one of them, a man in a conference lanyard, walk within 2 feet of her and continue straight to the stairs without breaking stride. I walked over. "Can I get that for you?" She looked up. She had sharp, dark eyes behind the glasses, the kind that miss very little. "I'd appreciate that very much," she said, clear voice. Not overly grateful, not annoyed. Just matter of fact, the way someone speaks when they've gotten used to the world being a mixed bag. I pressed the button and stayed while we waited. It felt wrong to press a button for someone and immediately walk away, like holding a door and letting it close before they're through. "Here for the logistics conference?" I asked. "Peripherally," she said, with a slight smile that suggested she found something about that description privately accurate. "Ted Calloway," I said. "Meridian Logistics out of Mississauga." "Miriam Holt," she said. She didn't add anything to that. No company, no title, just the name. The elevator arrived. I held the door. She wheeled herself in and I stepped in behind her out of habit, realized I was now committed to sharing an elevator without knowing her floor, and pressed 4 for myself. "What floor?" I said. "4, actually. Small world, smaller than you'd think," she said. She was looking at the elevator doors, but I had the distinct impression she was doing 2 things at once. "You said peripherally," I said. "What does that mean for a logistics conference?" She glanced at me sideways. "It means I'm not here to talk about freight rates." I almost said, "Fair enough," and left it there. But something about her directness made me ask instead, "What are you here to talk about?" She considered me for a moment. The elevator was slow. The kind that makes you think the cables might be original. "The acquisition," she said simply. And then the doors opened on 4, and she wheeled herself out, and I followed because my room was that way. And she turned left at the end of the corridor, and I turned right. And I went into my room and set down my bag and stood in the middle of the room for a moment thinking about that word, the acquisition. I didn't know yet what it meant. I wouldn't know until the next morning, in the way things you should have connected earlier always arrive all at once. with that slightly embarrassing quality of being obvious in retrospect. I called Sandra that night after dinner, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with the television on low. "How's the conference?" "Fine." The afternoon session was fine. I met someone interesting. Interesting how? I don't know exactly. She was waiting by the elevator. Couldn't reach the button. I helped her. Sandra waited. She said she was here for the acquisition. What acquisition? That's what I don't know. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Ted? Do you ever just help someone without it turning into something? Often, I said. This one felt different. She made a sound that was not a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Get some sleep. You always overthink things in hotel rooms. She wasn't entirely wrong about that either. The morning session was panel-based. 4 people talking about intermodal disruptions in the prairies, which was legitimately my area. And I was actually paying attention when the doors at the back of the conference room opened, and 2 people came in quietly and took seats at the side. One of them was Miriam Holt. The other was a man I recognized. His name was Patrick Norse. He was 62 years old, and he was the chairman of the board of Norse Capital Holdings, which was the majority stakeholder in 6 logistics and freight companies across Canada, including, as of 8 months ago, a 34% stake in Meridian Logistics Group. I had seen his photograph in 3 separate industry publications. I had seen it again 2 weeks ago, when Curtis had forwarded us all a note from senior leadership about ongoing investor relations. Patrick Norse was sitting 12 feet from me. Miriam Holt was sitting next to him. I looked at the panel. I looked at Patrick Norse. I looked at Miriam Holt, who was looking at the panel with the attentive patience of someone who was simultaneously thinking about 17 other things. The session ran 90 minutes. At the break, I stood in the coffee line, moving slowly through the particular small talk shuffle of conference morning breaks, and I felt someone stop beside me. "You're thinking about something," Miriam said. I looked at her. "I put it together this morning." "What did you put together?" "You're here with Patrick Norse. He's Norse Capital." I paused. "We're one of his companies." She picked up a coffee cup and handed it to the person running the urn. "One of several," she said. "What's your role?" She accepted her coffee. "I've known Patrick for 30 years, she said. "My late husband and his father were partners. I hold a seat on the oversight committee of Norse Capital." She looked at me directly. "I come to these events because Patrick asks me to, and because at my age you earn the right to be useful only when you actually want to be." She paused. "I wanted to see the people. The operations people specifically, not the executives. The ones who actually know what's happening in the freight lanes." She tilted her head slightly. "You'd be surprised how much you learn about a company by watching who they send to a Tuesday conference in November." I thought about Curtis on his ski lift in Banff. "What have you learned so far?" I said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Quite a bit," she said. "More this morning." She picked up her coffee. "Enjoy the next session, Ted Calloway of Meridian." She wheeled herself toward a table near the window, and I stood there holding my coffee for what was probably too long. That afternoon I sat through 2 more sessions and took better notes than I had in years, not for any strategic reason, but because Miriam's phrase, "the people who actually know what's happening," had landed somewhere specific in me, and I found I wanted to be worthy of it. Ridiculous, maybe. I was 57 years old, and a woman I'd met by an elevator had made me sit up straighter in a conference chair. But that's what happened. At dinner that evening, the association had arranged a round table for attendees. 12 people at a long table, a mix of companies and roles. Miriam was at the far end. Patrick Norse arrived late, took the remaining seat, and ended up 3 chairs from me. I'm not going to say it was a calculated performance on my part. I was just talking about what I knew. The Atlantic restructuring came up, naturally, because someone asked about cold chain efficiency, and I had the numbers in my head, the way you have things in your head when you've lived inside them. I talked about the Edmonton transition. I talked about what I was currently watching with cross-border delays out of Windsor. I talked about it the way you talk about something when you've been doing it for 22 years, and you actually care about whether it works. At some point I was aware that Patrick Norse was listening, not in a pointed way. He wasn't taking notes or turning to face me. but there's a quality to certain people's attention that you can feel from 3 chairs away, and I felt it. I also felt, later, Miriam watching me from the end of the table with the same measuring patience she'd had in the lobby by the elevator. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a while. I texted Sandra, "Strange 2 days, tell you when I get home." She texted back, "Good strange or bad strange?" I thought about it. Not sure yet. Good maybe. 3 weeks later I got a phone call I was not expecting. It wasn't from Patrick Norse. It was from someone named Teresa Almeida, who identified herself as the VP of Human Capital at Norse Capital Holdings, and who asked whether I would be available for a conversation with Patrick Norse and several members of the board at their Toronto offices. I said I was available. I did not tell Curtis. I've thought about whether that was the right call. I went back and forth on it for 3 days. In the end, I decided that I had spent 12 years being transparent about my ambitions with a person who had used that transparency to keep me exactly where I was, and I was entitled to one conversation without reporting it upstairs first. The Norse Capital offices were in a tower on Bay Street, 31st floor, view of the lake on one side and the financial district on the other. The kind of office that is designed to tell you immediately who has the leverage. Teresa met me at reception and walked me to a boardroom, where Patrick Norse was already seated. Miriam Holt was at the far end of the table. There were 2 other people, whose names I've agreed not to include here. Patrick stood when I came in. He was shorter than he'd seemed at the conference dinner, but with a focused presence that took up more room than his height suggested. "Ted, thank you for coming in. I'll skip the small talk because I think you're the kind of person who prefers that." "I am," I said. He sat. I sat. "I've spent the last 3 weeks doing a deep review of Meridian's operational infrastructure," he said. "Not the executive reports. The actual operational files. Vendor contracts, regional performance data, client retention figures, incident logs." He paused. "Your name appears in a lot of those files, predominantly in the good sections." I didn't say anything. "Your name also does not appear in the title that any of that work should have generated," he said. "That's a different kind of appearance. The kind that tells me something about the organization." I looked at him. "Can I ask how this conversation came about?" He glanced at Miriam. "I told Patrick about the elevator," she said. "Specifically, I told him about the 8 people who had walked past me in that lobby in 20 minutes, and the one who hadn't. I'd never counted them. I only remembered 3. The elevator was useful context," Patrick said. "What found in the files was the reason." I recognized the structure of what he was saying. 2 different things. Miriam had shown him where to look. What he found was its own answer. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. "Meridian is going through a leadership restructuring," Patrick said. "Norse Capital is moving to a more active oversight model. We're establishing a national operations director role. It would sit above regional management, direct reporting line to the new Meridian CEO, who reports to our board." He named the compensation range, which I will simply describe as substantially more than I had been making, and leave it there. "Because the money was not the thing that mattered most in that room. We'd want you out of Mississauga and into the national role within 60 days if you're open to it. We want someone who actually understands what's happening in the freight lanes." He used Miriam's exact phrase. I noticed that. "I have a question," I said. "Please, is this because of the lobby? Because Miriam told you about the elevator?" I needed to ask it. I had spent 12 years in a place where I couldn't tell the difference between being valued and being managed, and I was not walking into something new without knowing which one this was. Patrick looked at me steadily. "Miriam told me to look at Meridian more carefully," he said. "What I looked at is the reason you're sitting here. Those are 2 separate things, and I want you to know the difference." I sat with that for a moment. "I'd need to understand the timeline better," I said. "I'd need to talk to my wife, of course, and I have some documentation I'd want to walk you through before we finalize anything. Operational history, a few contracts, some irregularities I found during a review 2 years ago that were never properly addressed." Patrick's expression didn't change, but something in it sharpened. "What kind of irregularities?" The kind that involve a direct manager and a preferred vendor with a significant overlap in personal interest, I said. I documented it at the time. I wasn't sure what to do with it then, I'm more sure now. Miriam, at the end of the table, set down her pen. Bring the documentation, Patrick said. I did. 12 pages, printed, organized by date. Curtis had been routing certain freight subcontracts to a company called Bayview Carrier Solutions, a small operator out of Hamilton that had been given preferential rate access without competitive tendering. Bayview Carrier Solutions was a numbered company. The numbered company had two registered principals. One of them was a man named Webb. Not Curtis, his brother-in-law, Dennis. But the connection was there, and the documentation was mine. And I had been sitting on it for 2 years because the timing was always wrong. I put it on the table in front of Patrick Norse and let him read. He read the whole thing. He turned pages slowly without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. Why didn't you bring this forward earlier? I thought about that for a moment. Because the person I would have brought it forward to was the person in the documents, I said. And the person above him had never given me any reason to believe he was paying it attention. Patrick nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something. He'll be paying attention now, he said. I accepted the role formally on a Thursday, 11 days later. Sandra and I had spent those 11 days doing what you do when a significant thing lands in the middle of your life. Checking the details, asking the questions, having the late conversations at the kitchen table after our youngest was in bed. Sandra had a quality of processing decisions from every angle simultaneously that had always made her the smarter half of the partnership, and she turned this one over thoroughly. On day 10, she looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You're going to take it." Yes. You've already taken it in your head. I've been thinking about it carefully, Ted. You've been sleeping better for 10 days. She wasn't wrong. The announcement went to Meridian staff on a Friday morning. National Operations Director, reporting to the incoming CEO, effective in 60 days. I know it went out at 9:17 because I was in a vendor call, and my phone started doing things on the table that vendor calls don't usually produce. I finished the call. I set my phone down. I looked at the window. At 9:23, Curtis appeared at the entrance of my workspace. I had a corner desk on the operations floor, not an office. Just a desk I'd occupied for 8 years, with a divider on one side and a view of the parking structure. He stood there for a moment. Ted. He said it the way you say a name when you're using it to buy time. Curtis. I just saw the announcement. So did I. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. National Operations Director. He said the title like he was translating it from another language. Reporting directly to the new CEO. Ubbo. That's right. He was quiet for a moment. I watched several things move across his face in quick succession. Disbelief. Calculation. Something I'd describe as the specific discomfort of a man whose internal model of the hierarchy has just been quietly turned upside down. I wasn't aware this was being considered, he said. Neither was I said. Until recently. How did? He stopped. Started again. The board doesn't usually engage at this level directly. They did this time, I said. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and I thought about February, about the Tag Heuer watch and the word engine, and I didn't say any of that because I didn't need to. He was working it out for himself. Well, he said, congratulations. Thank you, Curtis, I said. Have a good weekend. I turned back to my desk. He stood there for another moment. Then I heard his footsteps move away, and I looked at the parking structure through the window and felt something unwind in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding tight for 12 years. That was Friday. On Monday, Patrick Norse's team opened the vendor irregularity investigation. HR and legal were involved. I wasn't in those meetings. That was appropriate. I had put the documentation on the table, and the table belonged to someone else now. Curtis was placed on administrative leave by Wednesday afternoon. I found out most things that week, which was through my colleague Beverly from the Contract Tracks team, who texted me at 4:48 that afternoon. He walked out with a file box and a look on his face I will never forget. Hope you're having a good week. I was in my car in the Meridian parking lot when I read that. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. I looked at the building, the one I'd walked into and out of for 22 years, and I sat with what that felt like. It wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the particular stillness you feel when a thing that has been unresolved for a very long time finally resolves itself, not with a crash, just with a kind of settling. Like a building after a long, slow wind. I drove home. Sandra knew from my face when I came in the door. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." She has a theory that tea is required for any news that is either very good or very bad, and that the category can be determined later. I've stopped arguing with the theory. I sat down and told her about Curtis and the box. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" "Settled," I said. That's the word that keeps coming up. Settled. She brought the tea and sat across from me. "He's going to be fine, you know. People like that always land somewhere." "I know. Does it matter?" I thought about it honestly. "Less than I thought it would," I said. She nodded. "That's healthy." Miriam called me herself 3 weeks into the new role. Not through Teresa or Patrick's office, her own mobile. I'd saved the number from her brief text after the Thursday signing, which had said only, "Well done. Don't waste it." She called on a Tuesday morning and I stepped out of a vendor briefing to take it. "How's the national role?" she asked. "Larger than I expected," I said. "Bigger than my previous scope in every direction." "Good, it should be. That's what you've been doing at the regional level without the authority to do it properly." I paused. "Can I ask you something? Please, in the lobby." "When I came over, what did you actually think in that moment?" She was quiet for a beat. "I thought you had good instincts," she said, "and I thought you were tired. Tired. The kind of tired that comes from doing good work in a place that doesn't see it." I recognized it. I've seen it in a lot of people over the years. Another pause. And I thought that if Meridian couldn't recognize that quality, that was useful information for Patrick. I looked out the window of the corridor I was standing in. One I didn't know well yet, in a building I was still learning. "You were going to be left alone in that lobby until someone walked past," I said. "I had been for 20 minutes, she said, without complaint or drama. "Just the fact of it." "I didn't do it for any reason," I said. "I want you to know that. I just saw you waiting." "I know," she said. "That was the point." She rang off shortly after. I went back into the vendor briefing. I sat at the head of the table, a table that was mine now, with people on both sides waiting for me to tell them where we were going next. I picked up my pen. That evening, Sandra made pasta, and our youngest sat across from me eating with one elbow on the table, despite 3 separate requests to remove it. And the radio was on in the kitchen, the way it always is on Tuesdays, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I realized I hadn't had a Sunday night dread in 7 weeks. Not once. I'd had it every Sunday for 12 years with the kind of low-grade reliability that you stop noticing, like traffic noise from a nearby road. It was just part of the texture of the week. And then one Tuesday in November, it had quietly stopped. "You're smiling," my youngest said, without looking up from the pasta. "Am I? You've been doing it at dinner for like a month. It's different. You look less like you're thinking about something." Sandra looked at me over the pasta bowl with the expression she wears when she's decided not to say something, because the situation has already said it. "I'm just here," I said. "You're always here," my youngest said, with the particular patience of a 15-year-old explaining the obvious. "I know. I said. I mean, I'm actually here now. There's a difference." My youngest considered this with the serious expression of someone deciding whether that makes sense. Then went back to the pasta. Sandra reached across the table. Her hand was warm. For 12 years I'd kept the engine running in a building that couldn't see past the dashboard. But, sitting at that table, with the radio on and the elbow back on the table despite everything, I understood that the engine was never the small part. They'd just been looking at the wrong thing.